The flood warning arrives at 2:17 in the morning on a Thursday in September, and in the town of Millhaven, population 2,043. It arrives as a text alert on the phones of whoever has their phones on. Approximately 60% of the population. In the low-lying neighborhoods south of the creek, approximately 412 people are asleep. 40 miles away, in the city of Carver, Daniel Yuen is not asleep. He has not been asleep since 11 p.m., when the Weather Service's preliminary models began producing outputs that he does not like. He has been watching the models for 4 hours with the specific focused attention of a man who spent 3 years as Millhaven's emergency management planner before the town council voted 14-0 to terminate his contract in 2021, and who has been watching the rainfall accumulation data for Millhaven's watershed with the specific dread of someone who prepared for exactly this scenario and was told that his preparation was alarmist. He picks up his phone. He calls a number. The number belongs to a woman named Yolanda Marsh, who is 58 years old and who has lived on the south side of the creek in Millhaven her entire life, and who is one of 4 people in Millhaven who stayed in contact with Daniel Yuen after the town council's vote, and who is therefore, when his call arrives at 2:31 a.m., already awake. Daniel, she says. Yolanda, he says, it's time. He had been hired in 2018, 34 years old, a licensed civil engineer with a specialization in hydrology and flood mitigation. The town of Millhaven had applied for a state grant to fund an emergency management planning position and hired Daniel on the recommendation of the state's emergency management office. What he found in the first 6 months was a specific combination of outdated documentation, deferred maintenance, and optimistic assumptions that he recognized as the combination that produces disasters when conditions change faster than the assumptions made about them. The creek that ran through the south side of Millhaven had been channelized in 1987, a concrete line channel designed to handle the 100-year flood event as it was modeled in 1987. Climate patterns had shifted since 1987. The channel's capacity had not been upgraded. The downstream culvert under the county road was partially blocked with sediment accumulation that Daniel had physically inspected and documented in a report submitted to the town council in March of 2018. The report recommended 4 things: culvert maintenance, updated flood modeling, a revised evacuation plan for the south side neighborhoods, and the installation of a real-time water level monitoring system. The total cost, approximately $240,000. At the April 2018 meeting, the council chairman, Victor Cole, who had been chairman for 9 years and who owned Millhaven's largest real estate development firm, asked only one question: about the impact on property values near the creek. Then he said, I think we need to be careful about generating alarm in our community based on modeling that may not apply to our specific local conditions. Daniel said, the culvert is 40% blocked with sediment. I have photographs. Victor Cole said, we appreciate your diligence, Daniel. We'll take it under advisement. What taking it under advisement meant was that the report was filed, the recommendations were not implemented, and Daniel was watched with the specific combination of managed distance and occasional public dismissal that institutional bodies deploy against people who have said things they did not want said. He had raised the recommendations again at the September 2018 council meeting and been told the matter was still under review. He raised them at the January 2020 meeting and was asked whether the modeling had been independently verified. He said yes, the state's emergency management office had verified it as a condition of his hire. Cole said he would like it verified by someone the town commissioned independently, a delay tactic that cost 5 months. And was conducted by a firm with an undisclosed billing relationship with Cole Properties. The independent verification confirmed Daniel's findings. The council allocated $20,000 for an updated drainage study, 10% of the minimum recommended expenditure, and Daniel characterized this in a letter to the editor of the Millhaven Gazette as insufficient to address documented infrastructure deficiencies that represent a material risk to the lives of residents in the south side floodplain. The letter was the beginning of the end of Daniel Yuen's tenure in Millhaven. His landlord declined to renew his lease. The hardware store began scheduling deliveries he could not receive. He was not invited to community events his role would normally have included him in. A story appeared in the Gazette sourced to unnamed community members, describing him as an outside hire who has struggled to understand the specific character of Millhaven's community needs. In February 2021, the town council voted 14-0 to terminate his contract on the grounds of budget constraints. He packed his apartment, he drove to Carver. He kept 4 phone numbers. The 4 people whose numbers Daniel kept were Yolanda Marsh, who ran a daycare on the south side, Darnell Okafor, 73, who had lived in his house for 48 years, Priya Singh, a 4th grade teacher who had read the flood report and come to his office to ask questions, and Grace Chu, 51, a dispatcher for the county's rural fire service who understood the inadequacy of Millhaven's emergency communication infrastructure. These 4 had reached out after Daniel left to tell him the council had done the wrong thing. He had thanked them. He had stayed in contact. He had also, in those 2.5 years in Carver, continued to develop the evacuation plan that Millhaven had not implemented. Not formally, not as a paid engagement, as the specific ongoing work of someone who knows a place and knows its risks and cannot stop knowing them simply because the place has chosen not to listen. He had updated the flood modeling as new climate data became available. He had mapped the evacuation routes, which neighborhoods needed to move first, which roads would remain passable at what water levels, where the high ground gathering points were, which community members had mobility limitations and would need assistance. He had built a communication tree using the phone networks of Yolanda and Darnell and Priya and Grace, who collectively knew the South Side residents and could reach them. He had walked Yolanda through the plan on a video call 18 months after leaving. He had given Grace the specific weather thresholds that would indicate an imminent flooding event. Grace had called him at 11 p.m. on the Wednesday before the flood. He had been watching the models since then. The call tree activates at 2:31 a.m. The list has 47 names, 47 people who are, between them, responsible for alerting and assisting approximately 400 residents of the Southside floodplain, organized according to the specific geographic and social logic that Daniel had mapped from 2 years of learning which neighbors watch out for which neighbors. Yolanda calls 8 people, each calls 4 more, each of those 4 calls 2 more. It is a structure that Daniel had modeled specifically to be executable by a 58-year-old woman making calls from her kitchen at 2:30 in the morning. Without a command center, without official authorization, without anything except the knowledge that the water level on the upstream monitor, a device Daniel had purchased with his own money and arranged to have installed through Grace's fire service connection, was rising at a rate that his models said would reach the culvert's blocked capacity in approximately 90 minutes. The elderly residents go first. Darnell is calling the 7 households in his immediate radius whose residents are over 70. 6 of the 7 have vehicles. One does not. An 82-year-old woman named Mrs. Fontaine who lives alone, and Darnell has arranged, specifically and in advance, that the family 3 houses down will take her. Priya is at the elementary school on high ground gathering point 1 unlocking the building. Because Grace had arranged with the school principal 6 months ago that Priya would have a key and the authority to open the building in an emergency. The principal had given Priya the key, after a conversation that Priya had described to Daniel on their monthly check-in call as the one where I explained why someone who no longer works for the town had built a better emergency plan than the town's emergency coordinator. The 90 minutes between 2:31 a.m. and 4 a.m. are not dramatic in the cinematic sense. They are the specific, practical, organized work of a community executing a plan, the unglamorous business of people getting out of bed in the middle of the night and getting into cars and driving to the elementary school on the hill. The creek rests at 3:47 a.m. The county road bridge goes underwater at 3:52. The south side neighborhoods flood at 4:09, beginning with the lowest streets and working inward. When the water reaches the first houses, a foot of water, then 18 inches, then 2 feet. There are no people in those houses. There are 2 exceptions. One, an elderly couple who had turned off their phones, was reached by Darnell physically, who drove to their house at 3 a.m. and knocked until they answered and helped them into his car. One family whose patriarch had decided the alert was overblown and gone back to sleep was reached by Yolanda, who had called the teenage daughter's cell phone. The family left at 3:50, 11 minutes before the water reached their street. 387 people are at the elementary school when the flood peaks. Victor Cole, the town council chairman, is not among them. Victor Cole lives on the north side of town, which does not flood. He learns what is happening at 5 a.m. when the county emergency service calls him to inform him that the southside neighborhoods are underwater and that several hundred residents have been evacuated to the elementary school. He does not know at 5 a.m. that the evacuation happened the way it happened. The State Emergency Management Office investigation, which begins 3 days after the flood, finds 3 things the town council does not fully anticipate. The first is the culvert. The partially blocked culvert that Daniel documented in 2019 and that was not maintained was the proximate cause of the flooding. The sediment accumulation had reduced the culvert's effective capacity to 62% of its design specification. The flood event, while severe, would not have reached the level it did without that reduction. The county road engineer confirms this. The report uses the phrase preventable flood severity 4 times. The second is the conflict of interest finding. The state review opened in 2020 and still technically active has been reactivated and accelerated. The firm that provided the independent verification of Daniel's flood report was found to have an undisclosed billing relationship with Cole Properties. The report concludes that Victor Cole's management of the process represented a material conflict of interest and a failure of duty of care to residents. The third thing is Darnell Alcaffer, 73, sitting in front of the state investigator Dr. Rebecca Soto on a Tuesday afternoon, describing what happened between 2:31 a.m. and 4 a.m. She asks who developed this plan. Daniel Yuen. When was it developed? He developed the official version when he worked for the town. The town did not implement it. He kept updating it after they let him go. He continued developing the plan after the town terminated his contract. Yes, for free. He said he knew the place and he knew the risk and he could not unknow it. Dr. Rebecca Soto writes something in her notebook. She underlines it. And the town's official emergency coordinator. Where was Raymond Prout on the night of the flood? Darnell is quiet for a moment. His phone was off, he says. Daniel Yuen receives the call from Dr. Rebecca Soto on a Friday afternoon. She describes the investigation and its findings and asks him to participate in a formal interview. He drives to the state capitol. He sits across from Dr. Soto and 2 colleagues and describes, over 3 hours, the full history of his work in Millhaven. 2019 report, the council's response, the conflict of interest documentation, the termination, and the post-termination work he had continued on his own time. He brings documentation. He has always brought documentation. Dr. Soto at the end of 3 hours says, Mr. Yuen, I want to tell you something directly, because I think you have earned that. The state's position, pending completion of the investigation, is that your termination was retaliatory and that the failure to implement your recommendations constitutes an actionable failure of duty by the town's leadership. Daniel looks at the table. He thinks about 3 years of being right. He thinks about 387 people at an elementary school while the water rose. There were 387 people in that school, he says. Yes, Dr. Soto says, I needed there to be no one left in those houses, he says. That was the plan. The plan was for the houses to be empty. The houses were empty, Dr. Soto says. He nods, he looks at the window. Thank you, he says. It is not what she expected him to say, and she has been doing this work for 20 years. Thank you for taking the investigation seriously. The investigation, she says, was made considerably easier by the quality of the documentation you provided in 2020. Without it, the conflict of interest finding would have required another 6 months. You prepared documentation for a complaint you were not sure would ever be acted on. I prepared it the way I prepare everything, Daniel says, in case it was needed. Daniel returns to Millhaven on the 1-year anniversary of the flood, at Yolanda's invitation, for a community gathering at the elementary school. He parks at the edge of the lot and walks to the entrance, where Yolanda is waiting. She has the specific quality of someone who wanted to be the person there when he arrived. The gymnasium is full. Daniel stands in the back, which is where he has always stood in rooms where other people are the main event, and he watches the community he spent 3 years trying to serve and that spent 2 of those years actively not listening. Victor Cole has resigned from the town council. The culvert has been replaced. The emergency management planning position has been refilled. Julia Torres, 29, who asked to speak with Daniel before accepting the position, and to whom Daniel gave the updated model, the evacuation plan, the communication tree structure. He told her the plan is the easy part. The hard part is the relationship with the community. 4 people made the plan work. You need to find your 4 people. She found her 4 people in the first 6 months. Yolanda Marsh is one of them. Daniel finds Daniel in the back of the gymnasium. He is 74 now and walks with a cane. They stand together watching the room. You know what I keep thinking about, Darnell says, all the towns. All the other places where somebody like you is trying to say something and the person in charge does not want to hear it. He pauses. You think those places have 4 people? Daniel thinks about his consultancy, the 14 municipalities in 2.5 years, the specific constancy of their being, in each place, some number of people who understood what was true and who needed a structure to work from. Yes, I think they all have 4 people, sometimes more. The trick is finding them. Darnell nods. You're still doing that? Yes, Daniel says, that's the work. 2 years after the flood, the State Emergency Management Office publishes new guidance for rural municipal flood preparedness built on a framework. Dr. Rebecca Soto developed drawings specifically on what happened in Millhaven on the night of the flood. The framework is called the Community Anchor Network Model. It is based on the principle that effective emergency response in communities with limited institutional infrastructure depends on the prior identification and activation of community members who have deep local knowledge, broad social trust, and the willingness to act without waiting for official authorization. The framework does not mention Daniel Yuen by name. This is intentional, Dr. Soto told him, when she shared the draft for technical review, that naming him would make the framework feel like a case study rather than a generalizable model, and that she wanted it adopted by 100 communities, not held up as an example of one remarkable person. He had agreed, the framework matters more than the attribution. The framework has been adopted by 47 rural municipalities across the state. Each of them has identified its community anchor network. Each of them has a communication tree. Each of them has a plan for the mobility-limited residents, the elderly, the households without vehicles. 47 plans. 47 sets of 4 people, or 6 or 8, who know what to do when the phone rings at 2:30 in the morning. Daniel Yuen does not know what crisis each of those plans will eventually be activated for, or when or whether the activation will come. The plans are not predictions, they are preparations. They are preparations. He learned the difference at 34 years old in a town that would not listen to him. He has spent the years since making sure the next town does not have to learn it the same way.